My name is Jessie Ace. I'm part of a group of enabled warriors that you've probably never heard of. We're fighting back against our invisible illness and taking the dis out of disability. We don't give sympathy to our symptoms. They enable us to be the warrior that we are. If you ask doctors and nurses, they'd say what we're doing is impossible. But pushing the limits of our conditions is something that we have to break through every single day. If we push the limits, we are mentally strong and we can do anything. The question is, how far can we push those limits? This podcast will give you the answers. I'm Jessie Ace, and this is the Disabled to Enabled podcast. Experience the benefits of pure hive power with the bee-powered honey. This therapeutic blend of royal jelly, bee pollen, propolis, and raw honey is designed to support those heavy, low-energy kind of days while supporting your immune system, promoting mental clarity and encouraging overall balance. Try a spoonful on those sleepy mornings, napless afternoons, and before intense workouts. So go and click the link in the show note and invest in your health today. Enabled Warriors, our next guest on the show is an entrepreneur, voice actor, writer, and activist who lives in Los Angeles. Originally from New York City, she has seen her fair share of, air quotes, top docs, and she was diagnosed with Hashimoto's disease and sleep disorders in 2017. This sparked her interest in the invisible illness community and her fellow Spoonies, with whom she wishes to commune and share information, inspiration, and comfort while advocating for greater awareness among friends, family, co-workers, and society at large. Graduating from London's Royal Academy of Dramatic Art with a BA Hons in acting in 2008, she has worked extensively in fashion to pay the bills. She's a longtime student of the School of Hard Knocks and What's the Matter You? Fall Down 7 times, Stand Up 8. Enabled Warriors, please help me in welcoming the host of Uninvisible Pod, my friend Lauren Freedman, everybody! Woo! Hey, Lauren.
Hello. Hi, I'm good, thank you. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you so much for being here, my lovely. Okay, so let's get into this first part of the interview. This focuses on when you kind of started to get symptoms, which later revealed your diagnosis. So keep listening to Enabled Warriors to find out how today's guest then coped in episode 2 and thrived as well, with questions from our Enabled Warriors Facebook group, and then listen out for episode 3 for today's guest's answers to the not so super quick secrets round. Okay, let's get straight in to part 1. So you're currently living with Hashimoto's disease, sleep apnea, depression, and anxiety. How on earth did all of these things kind of start? Which one of them came first as well?
Well, the depression and the anxiety came years and years before the other 2 diagnoses. From my teenage years onward, I struggled a lot with depression when I was in high school, is really when things kicked off. And the anxiety, it turns out, because I didn't actually seek treatment. I sought treatment as a teenager with my parents' guidance and assistance. But it turned out when I found the right therapist years later that I'd been having panic attacks that I hadn't known what they were and how they manifested. And, you know, she sort of explained to me and teased out what they looked like and how they worked for me. And so realized that I'd been having not only the depression and anxiety, but also the panic attacks on top of it. And during this time, I was struggling a lot with perfectionism, and the idea of being a good student and trying to dot all my I's and cross all my T's. And, I think that ultimately I'm an example of someone for whom the educational system just wasn't designed for. While I did well at school, it just didn't get me toward any concrete goals, and didn't serve me best. And in fact, only just served to cause anxiety. So I was sort of, you know, encouraged to do well and to achieve and to get into a good college, and the way that you're supposed to go straight from high school to college to a job, which isn't quite that simple anymore in this economy, of course. No, indeed. And so as a result, I really struggled mentally. And I went to college in 2001. I went to university, 4-year university here in the United States. And 9/11 happened right as I was being taken in to my university. And I'm originally from New York City, as you mentioned. And I was away from New York when this happened. My parents were in New York. And the compounded anxiety that occurred, I mean, my mother was working in the Empire State Building that day, and I was sure that was going to be the next target, you know. Of course, my mom was like, let them come and get me. She really doesn't, she was like, I don't care, you know. She was going to live her life regardless, which I very much admire and emulate, wish to emulate, I should say. Anyway, so after this all happened, one of my coping strategies that developed was OCD. So I developed obsessive compulsive disorder. I started developing rituals because I was in constant fear that something would happen to my family. And I managed to get that under control after a few years using cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and found a therapist who specialized in anxiety, in OCD, and depression, and was able to really help me target all of the issues that I was having. And she's someone who I still have a relationship to this day, almost 20 years later. Wow. So I was very lucky to find her. And it was around my early 20s that the discussion of medication came up for the depression and anxiety. I had, up until that point, avoided having to take any kind of medication, and was very much against it, and felt, particularly as an artist, as I was working as an actor at this point, that it might deaden my emotions and sort of flatten everything about my existence, which in some ways probably needed to happen, because I was a bit living in the extremes and not living in the gray area. And eventually ended up on antidepressants, which have served me incredibly well. I've been on and off them over the last probably 15 years, and I'm on them currently and have been for a good chunk of time. And I just can really tell the difference. It used to be that my loved ones used to be able to tell me when something seemed off with me, and now I really tell the difference when I'm off the medication and when I'm on it, and I can see that it helps me sort through irrational thoughts and put aside these obsessive thoughts that can nag at my mind. So it helps me really put aside the stuff that isn't serving me. So I've managed to get a lot of that under control using cognitive behavioral therapy techniques and the medication. And medication doesn't work for everyone. It happens to have worked for me. And then a few years ago, I had reinvented my career, reinvented myself. Been working for many years as an actor, and decided I was tired of being a starving artist, and found an inroad to business management, and was working as the right-hand woman to a small business owner here in Los Angeles, and loving my job and living a very full life. And suddenly I started getting hit with really terrible fatigue and brain fog. And there was one weekend in particular that I'll never forget. It was right after I'd turned 34. I spent an entire weekend sleeping. I just couldn't get out of bed. And I thought, you know, to sleep a few extra hours was one thing. You know, I'd been known to sleep into the afternoons in my 20s after a hard night of partying or studying, you know. But here I was in my mid 30s, living a fairly balanced life, not pushing my body too hard, or so I thought. And I was so fatigued. It was like nothing I'd ever felt before. It felt like there was a weighted blanket on my body all the time, which is an interesting thing, because I'm scared of weighted blankets, because it gives me that feeling that being in bed gave me, that sort of claustrophobia. And I ended up, after this weekend, going to the doctor on the Monday morning right before work and saying, something's going on. Like, I don't know what it is, but I just couldn't get out of bed all weekend. And lucky enough, the nurse practitioner at my GP's practice ordered an autoimmune panel immediately. And it was upon ordering that autoimmune panel that she found out that I had something going on. And she said that she suspected I was developing Hashimoto's disease, And I was referred immediately to a rheumatologist and to an endocrinologist, both of whom I went to see. The rheumatologist sort of brushed me off and told me I was a woman working too hard, and was a woman actually, and sort of made me feel as though I would either have to get on some kind of medication that was like speed, or that I was just going to have to live tired. And the endocrinologist in the beginning sort of took me under her wing and said, "Oh, you poor thing, you must be so exhausted. Let's take care of you," and was so caring. And I really liked her. And she immediately got me on Synthroid, which is thyroid hormone. And I'll just give the audience a little bit of an idea of what Hashimoto's is as well, if that's helpful. So Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disease of the thyroid, and it causes the body essentially to attack the thyroid such that it can't produce thyroid hormone. Now, a normally functioning thyroid is constantly producing thyroid hormone and really helping your entire body function. It's a tiny little butterfly-shaped gland at the base of your neck. And you'd be amazed that such a small organ can actually have such a huge impact on your life. But in my case, in the way that my body was attacking my thyroid, it was causing hypothyroidism, which is an underactive thyroid. And in most all cases, this requires medication to correct. So I was put on this thyroid hormone replacement, as it were, and I still felt terrible. And months later, I was in the endocrinologist's office and I said to her, "I just still feel terrible." And she looked at my chart and she said, "Well, the numbers say you're fine, and I think you're doing great." And I was like, "But I'm not fine." I mean, I just barely managed to make it into her office that morning. I was absolutely exhausted. The brain fog was getting worse and worse. I was starting to make minor mistakes that were adding up at work, particularly with regard to bookkeeping and things that you can't make those mistakes, And yeah, so it was really, my boss was beginning to be concerned. I was certainly concerned, but I just was also so all at sea at this point, because I was just entirely living in a fog. It felt like I had a cloud over me and a weighted blanket on my back, and I just was dragging myself everywhere like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. And it turned out, eventually I found out that this endocrinologist, as many who have been traditionally trained, was only testing one number and needed to be testing a host of numbers in my labs in order to get a full picture of what was going on with my thyroid. She could gain from the numbers, she could glean that the thyroid hormone was in my body, but what she couldn't see was that my body wasn't absorbing the thyroid hormone. And this happens in a good number of cases of Hashimoto's disease. And I'm someone who was a candidate for combo therapy, it's called. And this is when you combine, so T4 is Synthroid, that's the thyroid hormone replacement. But for many of us, we need T3 in order to absorb T4. It's kind of like taking calcium in order to, or vitamin D in order to absorb calcium.
Gotcha.
So, after this visit with this doctor, and when she'd said I was fine, she also looked at me and she said, "Maybe it's time you see a psychiatrist." And I was really taken aback. And I thought, well, if she really looked at my chart, she'd see that I'm seeing a psychiatrist as well. And here was a second doctor, and also female, telling me that it was all in my head. And I left this appointment and called my mom immediately, because she's the person I turn to. She's my best friend and has helped me through so much of this ordeal. And my mom said, "You never need to go back to her again. We'll find you another doctor who's covered by your health insurance." And this can be a huge access block for a lot of people here in the US, is the health insurance industry creating issues with access to doctors. No, as well as access to information and understanding what your benefits are. I mean, it's such a complicated system and it's so expensive. And chronic illness and the lack of understanding of chronic illness puts a huge burden on the system. It's not designed for that. It's designed for acute care. It's not designed for preventive care. So my mom said, "Don't see her again. We'll find someone else." And at this point, we began searching for more people who were in the thyroid community. When I say we, I mean my mom. She had to do all the heavy lifting because I just couldn't wrap my head around it. My brain was so fogged. I could barely make it through work. And she, through a contact of mine who's also a health coach who happens to also have Hashimoto's, we discovered Dr. Isabella Wentz, who's a pharmacist out in Colorado who has Hashimoto's and has managed it with various therapies. And she happens to have on her website a bunch of links to doctors who work with thyroid medicine.
Oh,
So my mom went through that list and found people who were local and managed to find me purely by accident an integrative practitioner here in Los Angeles who I was able to go and see and who I still see now. And this practitioner immediately put me on combo therapy and did much more extensive lab testing on me. And we discovered so much more about my thyroid. And I learned so much from her and her approach. And since she put me on the T3, I've been a completely different person. There've certainly still been ups and downs at trying to get the numbers right. And with thyroid disease, with autoimmune disease, you have to constantly be going back in for regular lab testing to make sure that your levels are right. But she's really changed my life and gotten me on the straight and narrow. And this integrative approach has been key to my healing. While I was with this other endocrinologist at the time, she'd also suggested I get a sleep study because of my exhaustion, which I had done. And it turned out that I also had sleep apnea. So that was compounding my exhaustion and my brain fog. It's amazing what lack of sleep or poor sleep quality does to the body as well. I was an absolute mess. I was basically fully housebound. And sleep apnea basically means that I stop breathing in my sleep. So it varies in severity from person to person. And in some, this is situational, as in maybe they need to adjust their sleeping position or not eat gluten before bed, things like that. So it may or may not come along with snoring. And in all cases, as I've since learned, there's a physiological, perhaps I could call it a defect, if you will, in the throat, in that the throat closes off during sleep. So in order to get restful sleep and recycle my energy, I have to actually have air pumped into my respiratory system at a certain strength to keep me breathing normally. And that involves wearing a CPAP. But this opened up another 2 years of ongoing issues trying to get the right kind of sleep equipment, because the first sleep doctor I went to gave me a mask, because there are many different kinds of masks. And this mask made me feel completely claustrophobic. It covered my whole nose and mouth. And had a tube that came out the front. And I'm someone who moves around in their sleep. So it kept waking me up and slapping me in the face every time I turned over.
Oh, no.
And I thought, well, this isn't going to work. So I had to return the CPAP and go to the next step, which was a dental appliance. And this opened up another several months of dealing with a doctor who figured that he had the cure for everything and really didn't. And I ended up getting infections because of this dental appliance. It just wasn't a good situation. So I ended up chucking that idea and starting from scratch again with a new sleep doctor. And I've been very lucky to have found a number of excellent practitioners at UCLA Hospital here in Los Angeles. And the sleep doctor I found here was like, what about a nose pillow? And I was like, what are you talking about? He was like, haven't you tried the nose pillow? And I said, I don't know what that is, because no doctor had no one had ever suggested it to me, but it's a standard option with CPAP mask equipment.
Okay.
And it's a little pillow that sits right under your nose. So the air holes are right where your nostrils are, and it pumps air in. It's very compact. It straps around your face. So I still have to go to bed wearing headgear. But what's wonderful about the one I found that my doctor suggested to me is that the tubing comes out of the top of my head. So it doesn't slap me in the face when I move around. And the nose pillow makes me feel far less uncomfortable, and I can actually rest, because it's an adjustment period getting used to these masks as well. Really? So, of course, a lot of this was also triggering my anxiety and my depression. And again, I had to adjust my medications accordingly. And it took years and years. And here I am about sort of 2.5, 3 years later. And I'm a totally different person. But I've learned so much about the medical system, and it's really changed my life going through this chronic illness journey and meeting so many other people like you who are dealing with so many different invisible illnesses in particular that really heartened me, because there are so many women who are thrown through the medical system who are told it's all in their heads. And I was told that enough that it seemed alarming. And I can't imagine what it's like for people who were told that more than I was, who don't necessarily have the support system I do. And so I set out to try and change all of that.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
It really is. It's amazing, and it's funny how you suddenly become aware of so many more things when you do get something like this. And it's like, it's true that with the saying that you don't get it until you get it, if you know what I
So
mean by
true.
that. Because
Yeah, I
how would
absolutely do.
you?
I think we do because we get it now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had no knowledge of anything before. I was probably one of those people that just like would get angry in a car park if they saw someone using a handicap spot and didn't have a wheelchair because I didn't know any better, you know? So
Yeah.
I'm kind of
Well, I was the
making that
person
my
who was
mission.
like, I used to be that person who was like, all these gluten allergies. People have gluten allergies, but they're just not eating gluten. I just didn't believe in these
Yeah,
even minor afflictions and sensitivities that people have. But all of these things really do exist. And when you
it's
experience it and when
crazy.
it changes your life and turns your life upside down,
Hmm.
I was housebound for the better part of a year while I got better. And so this quarantine we're in right now for coronavirus I'm no stranger to it. As so many of us in the Spoonie community are not strangers to this
Yeah.
lifestyle, but it's completely changed my life. And it made me realize that like the 9 to 5 grind was never going to work for me, because
Yeah.
even though I'm better now or on the other side of this, my body just works at a different rate than other people's. I still have to manage potential triggers and fatigues. Yeah. And so it brings up a lot of extra planning that you have to do in your day to day.
Mm.
And a lot of respect for so many people in the community that at one point I brushed off out of my ignorance. And I'm so glad that in a sense, this entire experience brought me to my knees, because I needed that to happen. I needed to be humbled in order to see people differently. So it changed my perspective for the better.
Yeah, totally. I couldn't agree with you more. Like, just,
Mm.
yeah, totally did that for me as well. So, before we end up part one and go into part two, what 5 tips could you give someone with Hashimoto's or sleep apnea to kind of live their best lives every day?
So 5 tips. Number one, you know your body better than anyone else does. So you've got to trust your instincts. Um,
Love
if
that.
if
Yes.
you know, yeah, if you know something physiological is going on and it's not just psychological, you're right. It doesn't matter what anyone else tells you. Keep going to get a second opinion, a third opinion, a fourth opinion. So that's sort of also tip 2, is that you're allowed to get as many damn opinions as you want to. You need to keep searching until you find a medical team that you feel fully represents you. And it took me a good 2 years to get that together with help. So just keeping in mind that, it could take some time. I would also say, particularly here in the US, dealing with insurance, health insurance is a full-time job. So when you're brain fogged, it can be an additional labor. And I highly recommend asking a trusted friend or a loved one to help you sort through the mire. The main thing here is to put aside your pride, and recognize when you need to ask for help. So asking for help is huge. And I think it's very easy to sort of push on, as we always do. I think particularly as women, we're told to sublimate so much of our pain,
Oh,
our
yeah.
experience, from the
For
minute
sure.
we are born, from the minute we bleed. And for me, so much of my work was born out of women's health advocacy. And so I really do feel like you need to use the resources that are at your fingertips and take advantage of what people offer you. If they offer help and you trust them, say yes. If no
Mhm.
one's offering help, ask for help. Um, these experiences will take away any potential pride you thought you had. So best to ask for help before it gets the better of you, I think. And one tip I always try to remind my listeners about, and I think this is huge in terms of perspective and mental health, is that your life isn't any more or less complicated once you get a diagnosis or once you get sick. It's just complicated in new and different ways. So it's all about adjusting that perspective and adjusting expectations accordingly. And probably my last tip would be, don't wallow. I think you are allowed to feel terrible and to lean into that while you're figuring things out, but you need to limit the time you spend feeling crap about everything, and find community and start getting out there and removing negativity from your life. I think that a chronic illness diagnosis is actually an opportunity to actively remove toxic influences from your life. And
Yes,
that was certainly true for me, not only in terms of doctors who weren't serving me, but also in terms of work that wasn't serving me, and, one or two friends that weren't necessarily serving me. So being able to protect your energies and really focus on creating positivity around you is something really important, and community is a huge inroad to do that.
It so is, and I always say as well, if you can't find a community, make one, because guaranteed there is
Absolutely.
somebody else like you thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
So totally.
Mm.
Oh, those are amazing 5 tips. Thank you so much. And Enabled Warriors, that is it for part 1. It is all wrapped up. In the next episode, we will discuss the amazing things that Lauren has done since her diagnosis. So Warriors, look out for part 2. And if there is anything that we've spoken about so far that you can relate to, then please leave us a comment. And remember to subscribe or follow wherever you're listening today whilst you're there. So thanks, Lauren, and see you in a bit.
Thank you.
Are you ready to fight back against your chronic illness and go from being disabled to enabled? Do you want to be an enabled warrior? Someone who's brave, strong, and confident, and someone who's ready to find a way to achieve awesome things despite a diagnosis? This is your invitation. Check out disabled2enabled.com for articles and reviews to find out how you can become enabled too. Subscribe to the podcast to always be in the know. If you think this podcast is better than sleeping in on a Sunday, tickle that subscribe or follow button wherever you're listening. And make sure to share this episode with someone who needs some inspiration. Want to ask your questions to future guests? Make sure to join our Enabled Warriors tribe on Facebook and look out for our question posts. Before we go, check out Disabled2Enabled on Instagram for posts that tell it like it is. And remember, warriors, stay enabled.